Hi, and welcome back to the Mom and Mind podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kat. On this episode, I am talking with Dr. Ann Welsh, and we are talking about parental leave. This is a topic that is very confusing to people because, for one, there's just no uniform way that every state, every company does things. And if you've ever tried to figure out your own parental leave, you know that you could talk to three different people and get three different answers. And it's so confusing for people. And I honestly think that people aren't getting all of what they can get from parental leave because it's such a confusing system. So, Dr. Ann Walsh is doing work to help people figure this out. She is a clinical psychologist, executive coach, and consultant, and she began her career at Harvard before opening her own practice with a focus on working parents in growing their careers and families. She's an expert on the transition from working person to working parent, having dedicated her life to unraveling the interplay between career aspirations, personal fulfillment, and women's mental health throughout the lifespan. We get into a lot of great information, and specifically how becoming a parent gives you this whole new set of skills and how that can actually be beneficial to you and your employer. So let's get into it and meet Dr. Ann Welsh. Welcome, Ann. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here today.
I'm happy to have this conversation with you. And I know a lot of parents deal with the transition into being a working parent from, maybe prior just not having to kind of deal with what that transition would look like with having kids. So I had love to start there. If you can give some context to what we'll be talking about today in terms of just that concept, the idea of going from a working person to working parent.
Yeah, I'll back up and I just say that I love working with transitions. Like, I think that they
Mhm.
are, any transition we go through is this incredible time where there can be a lot of growth
Right.
and
Mhm.
there can be a lot of struggle. They can be really, really hard, right? Whatever we're going through, we can get focused on where we're coming from or what we want to get to, what we want kind of the final product to look like. And most of us aren't comfortable in that messy middle of transition. And yet that's kind of where the magic happens.
Mhm.
Uh, and I think what happens, what's so unique to the transition to working parent is you're doing a double transition simultaneously, right?
Mhm.
You have just had a kid. There is this complete overhaul of transitioning to parenthood. And that's true even if it's not your first, right? Every time if you
Right.
add a child to the family, it's still a very massive transition.
Totally.
Then, either a couple weeks, a couple months, even if it's a couple years later, you have a whole separate transition into
Mhm.
being a working because essentially everything you've done before as a working person may not apply anymore. A
Mhm.
lot of the old ways that you approach things might not be the ways that you can approach them anymore.
Right.
You have this whole new identity that of parent that you're kind of melding into the mix of your new identity, and
Mhm.
that's going to inherently shift how work looks for you.
Right.
Be really overwhelming, right? From a logistics standpoint, sure, right? Like just
For
getting
sure.
out the door in the
Yeah.
morning.
Yep.
Also, from that identity standpoint of what does my work even mean to me now? And how
Mhm.
does it shift if I'm making room for this piece of parenting too?
Yeah.
So much going on all at once. And I think a lot of times we don't give that second part, that working parent transition part, enough attention, right? Certainly from a
Totally.
work angle, workplaces are like, oh, here's your 6 weeks or whatever you get. And then you show back up and you're the same person. But even I think in ourselves, we don't often recognize how big of a deal it is. And we kind of expect ourselves to go through it more seamlessly than usually it happens.
I agree with you 1,000,000%. And I think from what I see in therapy with folks who are going back to work, there's what you said before, this there's so much pressure internally to be able to do things the way you've always done them and kind of like feel how you felt before. But if you've gone through this transition and things might have shifted for you, your priorities, how you think about things, um, and then you you don't totally realize that and you try and put yourself back into the work situation, oh my gosh, it's so hard because you might still be putting all that pressure on yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think that pressure, and again, from internal and external sources,
Oh,
is
yeah, yeah.
one of the things that makes this transition so hard, right?
Mm,
Because we built this system of the ideal worker and the ideal mother completely around self-sacrifice,
mm,
right? That
mm,
both of these roles, um, from a systems, from a cultural perspective right now, require you to kind of leave it all on the table at the end of the day. And it's impossible to do that for two things at once. There isn't
totally.
any path, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
maybe be for in any individual piece either, but certainly when you're trying to do it with two worlds, it's
Hmm.
yourself up for failure. So that pressure, and that awareness of what you think you quote should be doing is
Hmm.
just so weighty, and it's so I would echo what you said, right? That is so much of what clients come in to talk to me about is feeling like I must be failing and I must be the only one that's struggling with this because if that's what we're supposed to be, then
Right.
it's a problem.
Oh, right. And you're so right to bring it in and think about it through the lens of a system, systems that people are dealing with. Because if you are feeling it just so often happens that things that we feel like we're failing on in an individual level are actually system related.
Yeah,
But you're not like walking into your work thinking like this system is set up in a way to make me feel like I'm feeling like it just feels bad.
right, right. And I think we don't always talk about that, and so then you end up feeling like you're the only one.
Hmm. Hmm.
And again, I think there's probably, some degree of reinforcement from a workplace in that if the workplace sees it as an individual problem too, then they kind of absolve themselves of responsibility for changing it,
Boom.
right?
Yep.
If this is, oh, you're struggling with the transition, then we as an organization don't have to do anything differently. And that's a message I fight really hard against, especially in some of my consulting work, to try to create workplaces that get that they have a role here and
Mm.
that they could really support working parents in a different way.
Wow, there's so much in that what you're just talking about. I mean, yeah, I think we'll get into a little bit about that part about what systems can do in a minute. But if for now, can you talk about some of the other ways you've already listed several about like how being a working parent is so hard?
Yeah, yeah. Well, so certainly the pressure, like we were just talking about, right? So i- there's so much expectation
Yeah.
that we put on ourselves, right? So separate from the systems piece, I think that we ourselves feel we want to be good at our jobs and
Hmm.
we want to be good at parenting, right? And
Right.
so there are things we care a lot about and want to invest a lot in, and therefore it makes it really hard, right? Because of that. It's also a lot of newness to circle back to like what are we even talking about with this transition, right? And new things are hard and new things are pretty scary. Um, whether you've been doing it, whether even if you had been in your job for 20 years before you had a kid, doing it with a baby at home is still new.
Hmm.
uh, your whole nervous system is going to be kind of on high alert
Hmm.
because it's doing something different,
Hmm.
and there's going to be some signaling that, oh, maybe this isn't safe. So there's that too. I also think there is still discrimination in the workplace, right? And
Hmm.
that's of what makes it really hard. I've heard,
Yeah.
I could spend an hour telling you about some of the horror stories I have heard, but where workplaces, essentially take women out of the running for any sort of promotion or growth at work because they're parents, or even because they might become parents. Um, or where women feel like now that I have these other responsibilities at home and maybe they're uneven, I can't show up at work the way that I need to grow, or because they're thinking about how they may want to step back or take a pause and
Mm.
feel like, was that a valid choice or not? And they start questioning themselves. So there's all these complicated pieces in there that make this a really, really, really challenging time.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Um, I mean, I'm just thinking of that the discrimination part. And even like the preemptive actions that an employer might take if they even think you're going to be pregnant, or I imagine sometimes even if you're someone who can have babies,
Yep.
like whew, um, that is not necessarily known by the person who maybe is like looking to be a parent at some point. They might. It's not like an employer is going to say outright, "Hey, we're not going to give you this because you might at some point want to have a kid."
Right.
Um, the oof, like that's a dynamic that you could be feeling and not really know what is actually going on. That's that's really upsetting, but I know it does happen a lot. It doesn't happen everywhere. I'm not saying all employers are bad or they're not thinking about this stuff, but again, I think that would be one of the ways that somebody would feel um, like on an individual level if they're not advancing or they're not, getting the
Yeah.
promotion that they are up for, that they wouldn't necessarily know what's behind that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's, unlike other transitions too, when we are transitioning to parenthood and or to working parenthood, we're usually doing it alone in that we're not doing it with a whole bunch of peers simultaneously.
Right, right.
But if you're graduating from college, for the most part, a lot of people in your age, in your peer group, are going through it at the same time. So
Hmm.
you kind of at least have this developmental model of, oh, everyone's kind of struggling in different ways, and we're making our way through, and we're doing it all at once. It's a little easier to understand the context when
Hmm.
that's going on. With parenting and working parenthood, you may have a few friends doing it at the same time, but they're not going to be in your same company. Or you may have no friends doing it, right? I know for me, I had my first, and I was the first in my entire peer group to have a
Hmm.
kid.
Hmm.
So I had nobody to look around at and say, "Hey,
Hmm.
is this normal? Did you struggle with this at all?" And so it can feel lonely, but
Yeah.
also it can feel like, well, if I'm struggling, then it must be a me problem, right? And again,
Hmm.
back, I must be doing it wrong as opposed to this is hard because it's hard and
Yeah.
not something wrong.
Yep. Um, Gosh. Okay. So, um, I've heard many people during their first pregnancy think like, okay, well, yeah, I'm gonna have this baby, and then I'm gonna go back to work in 6 weeks or whatever it is. Um, and it is a challenge as a therapist to support them to understand that it might not be that straightforward. um because right, unless you're in the context of having that new baby at home, you don't really know yet how it's going to impact you. You might be able to say like, yeah, I'll be a little tired or something like that, but the idea that is often that they'll just be able to like go back and do the things, and kind of like not somehow that they'll be able to manage both of these things at the same time, in the same way that they've always managed everything else. And that might be true, but um, it's also a little bit of a setup to go into a new experience and feel like you're just going to be able to handle all of it. So yeah, how do you support people when they're going to be having a baby and they also want to be going back to work, to understand that like that being able to balance everything, quote unquote, whatever that means, is going to look different, or it's going to be harder, or even what it looks like at all.
Yeah, it's funny because I was totally that person. But at first, where my mom had worked, she was a physician, and she had 4 kids and had kind of, I think, some selective memory about what was hard and what was hard,
Right.
and I was like, oh, she did it. She made it look easy. It'll be fine. I'll be
Yeah.
fine. And I was lucky in that at the time I had my first, at least, I had a supervisor who was also a clinician and was kind of very good about welcoming in the mothering part when I returned to work, because I only had 6 weeks off. It was a really short leave. Um, and I was, of course, then taken aback by how hard it actually was, and kind of learned a good lesson for future future kids. But I think it's hard to think about what would have helped me understand that then,
Mm-hmm.
because for me, and I think a lot of my clients that have this mentality, there's a sense of wishful thinking and a little bit of, right, I don't want to acknowledge that I'm going to have to do it differently or that this
Mm-hmm.
isn't. So I think usually with those clients, I'll approach it with a, you may not need this, but I always advocate for more planning and more help than you think is necessary, because it's so much easier to peel it back than to add it on.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And
Good point.
so, I tell them to kind of treat that transition back to work almost like they're going to have the baby all over again, and to have maybe a little extra childcare, or we'll talk about what kind of flexibility they can have at their places of employment around how they come back, and have a freezer full of meals just like you did when you had the baby, because cooking is not going to be the thing that's high up on your list. um, and we talk a lot about communication, and how to do that with their employer and with their spouse if there's a spouse at home, and how to hold on to tidbits of self care in there. Because I think those are the two pieces that very easily get pushed out and make us feel worse when we're doing this kind of transition back to work.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I definitely I see that happen quite a bit. Especially the self-care part. Um, and for some people, just kind of singling out mental health and um, like how you cope and manage your own mental health. For some people, that's self-care. Let's say it's for some people it's exercise. For other people, it's long walks or whatever. um, or quiet, having downtime, quiet time, that sort of thing. It inevitably gets set aside because it um, is one of the easier things to say, well, I'll just do it later, or I don't need to do it today. And then days and weeks and months go by. But that can really impact mental health as well, to not have those self care practices in place.
Yeah, it's so much easier to disappoint ourselves than someone else in the
Mm-hmm.
short,
Mm-hmm.
and in the long term, that's not a viable strategy, right? In the long term, it doesn't work. Uh,
Right.
and I think we know that cognitively,
Mm-hmm.
but it's really hard to hold on to it in the moment and then make that decision that maybe disappoints someone else instead, to prioritize ourselves.
Yeah, that yes, that right. I mean, I'm just thinking of all of these people just very recently, even that I've been meeting with in therapy, and it's because you're negotiating so many different things. Especially if you were, let's say, the primary caregiver during your leave, and things are shifting and changing, and now partners or family or whoever is involved in care are they're needing to take over some of the responsibilities, uh, and that's where that like communication comes in that you were saying.
Yeah, yeah. And that's a really hard part of that transition. I mean, again, in an ideal world, I'll get on my soapbox, we'd have longer leave for all parents, including fathers, because it does set up this tricky dynamic right from the beginning where mom is doing more work than dad in families, both a mother and a father. Um, and it's hard to undo, right? Because I do fair play facilitating, and I talk a lot about this stuff within that context too. But if mom's already been the one caring for the kid for the 6 weeks or 6 months or however long they have, they've had some learning curve to figure out what works. And dad And then when you're trying to hand some of these responsibilities off and make things more even as you go back to work, you're already set up in this dynamic of dad feeling like, well, I don't know how to soothe the baby the way that you do, or I don't know how to do whatever X activity the way that you do, the bath time, the bedtime, or whatever. So you're better at it. You just do it. And moms sometimes perpetuate that too. I'm so guilty of
Mm-hmm.
having done this with my first, right? Of like, I'll just do it. It's
Mm-hmm.
easier if I do it. And I don't let him learn. And then we perpetuate these kind of uneven division of labor, which makes that transition back to work even harder. And yet it's actually really important to like give some of that stuff to your partner and use some of that time if you can for you to refuel.
Right. Yeah, you were talking about planning, doing, same amount of planning for return to work as you hopefully were able to do for postpartum. What kinds of things do you hear from people? If well, maybe even how do you help people when they say, "Oh, I don't need that. I don't want that," or maybe this feels like too much planning, or I don't want to ask anybody for that kind of help. How do you deal with not necessarily pushback, but yeah, that kind of I don't know what else to call it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. And I guess it depends on what the pushback is, right? If it is in the category of this feels like too much, I don't think I'm going to need that, then I might frame it in the context of um, again, it's better to have it and pull back on it. And I'll say something like the best return from leave is a well planned out leave before you go, right? So the more, in some ways, you plan how you're handing off your work, who you're handing it to, what your leave is going to look like, what that communication plan while you're on leave is going to be, and then how you will or will not pick things back when you return, right? The more that that's explicitly spelled out from a work perspective, the smoother this whole thing is going to go. So even if it feels like, wow, I'm doing a lot of planning, there's a lot of value in it. If the pushback is more along the lines of like, I don't want to be a burden, I don't want to ask for help, that might be a different conversation, right? And that's more around kind of people pleasing mindset of you're not meant to do this alone. You're going to have to ask for help, and kind of starting to work with why do you feel like it's a burden? Why are you not allowed to ask for help? And more some of those therapeutic interventions um,
Mhm.
around that idea of asking too much or taking up too much space.
Yeah, that's a that's a super tough one. Um, because I mean, I for a lot of people, that's not a new thing that they've been trying to deal with. That might be years and years, if not lifelong, of a pattern.
Yeah.
That can get really challenging. So, in terms of parental leave coaching, I first want to know what that is. Like, if you can describe to
Yeah.
people what that is. But I assume from what you're saying now that this type of coaching would be good to have as soon as possible.
Yeah. Yeah. So parental leave coaching is a specific type of coaching that kind of melds career coaching with mental health support
Mm.
through the period before you go on leave, during your leave, and in the transition back to work. So in an ideal world, I'm working with individuals um, from kind of after they announce their pregnancy through maybe even up to the first year of working parenthood, depending on how we define it. There can still be value in parental leave coaching, even if it's only that last part, right? And I will certainly work with people just on that transition back. But again, ideally, it's got this longer span. And also, ideally, it's sponsored by corporations, right? By organizations to support their employees and really show up in a way to say, we recognize that this is really hard and we'd like to help. And we'd like to put pieces in place because maybe we don't know how to do it as an organization.
Okay.
But essentially, it's pre leave is the planning piece that I was talking about, right? You're going to make a plan of who am I handing off my individual projects to? How am I going to communicate with my manager about that? There's also, if possible, I'll even meet with a manager and do some training with them around what to expect, what's realistic to expect of your employee. We'll design a plan for what communication is going to look like throughout that leave. And all of this knowing that plans might change, right?
Mhm,
We do
mhm.
not usually follow our plans. And you may, I want is X and get into it and say, never mind, I want something totally different. And that's okay. It's just starting to have those conversations, having the practice of talking about it and planning out what you think you might like, knowing that there's space. So, I've had clients who say, "Yeah, I want to have like weekly updates on from my team on what's going on while I'm on leave." And then they get into leave and they're like, "You know what? I don't want to hear from anybody for the next 3 months." That's okay, right? Then we can work with that. We can make that shift. That's totally fine. Um, then during the leave, again, depending on how long it is, we may meet a few times. As I am someone that is both a parental leave coach and a mental health provider, I do some checking up on the mental health piece while they're on leave, certainly, just checking on how the leave is going, how this plan is playing out, and then getting them ready on the other side to go back to work, and then providing support on the other end, of course, too, right? So what work are you picking back up? What work do you not want to pick back up, right? Like that's a big thing. As you come back, are you going to say, you know what, I handed off X project to so and so and I'm going to just let them keep it? I hate
Mhm.
doing that, or
Mhm.
my new lifestyle, or whatever.
Mhm.
And again, there's manager training on the other end to facilitate that ongoing communication. Because what I see a lot of times happen on the return and even going into it is that managers don't really know what to say, so they say nothing. But then it
Mhm.
feels like an elephant in the room. Like as a parent, you come back and you're like, nobody even mentioned I'm on leave, or they said, welcome back, and then stacked a bunch of papers on my desk, or like 400 projects via email. And it's kind of awkward. I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about it. Nobody's asking about it. So
Mhm.
kind of helping people understand how are we going to talk about this at work, and how are
Mhm.
we going to allow our employees to kind of parent out loud and be parents and bring that part of themselves, knowing that they'll do it in a work appropriate way, but that it's really important to make space for this change at the workplace.
Yeah, for sure. And it was something that you said. Uh, so for let me put it in a different way. I was going to go down one avenue, but I'm going to go a different direction. So a lot of the folks that I work with are people who are coming in because they've had a perinatal mental health condition show up, and now they're dealing with that. And I'm, responsible for taking them off of work and extending leave and things like that for them because they are not able to go back to work. Um, but then they're out of work longer than they anticipated. And to what you were talking about before, sometimes they're concerned that their people are going to ask them like, "Oh, well, how come you were gone for so long?" Um, and not necessarily trying to be intrusive, but it could be out of care or concern. And often people aren't sure how to deal with those types of conversations with their employers. Some people will say, "Oh, I feel like I need to tell them everything." I'm like, you don't legally have to tell them
Any
anything at all. But they might feel some responsibility about having been gone for so long, or feel guilt, or something like that. How do you help people navigate when there's been something serious happen, like they've had a traumatic situation, or a perinatal mental health condition, or both, and they're navigating that when they return.
Yeah. So, with the again, if I it depends on the angle, who I'm talking to. But if similar, like I've had clients that have had to take longer leaves or have gone back and then kind of had a hit with a perinatal mental health disorder later, right?
Hmm.
Because as we all know, right, they don't just show up right away.
Hmm.
Um, and so with them, I try to work out something that fits for them. Like, what's the story? What's the safe? I hate to say tagline, but kind of
Hmm.
what's the elevator pitch, if you will, of what feels safe for you to communicate given the constraints of your workplace.
Right.
Because that's going to feel so individually different depending on who. what their workplace is like and how supportive it is. And I think to your point, right, they don't have to say anything.
Right.
It's not required. And so we may anticipate questions, right? If someone says, well, gosh, you must have had a nice long vacation, that they can
Right.
respond, you know, how are you going to respond to those snarky comments? Maybe it
Mhm.
is,
Mhm.
yeah, leave was really challenging and beautiful at the same time, but I'm glad to be back, right? Like something that kind of just shuts it down.
Yes.
Um, Whereas, are there people that they might feel a little more safe sharing with? And what might that share look like? And
Mhm.
so, trying to get specific with them and kind of anticipating those conversations. And if I'm working with a manager, it is helping them understand how basically some of it's just education, right? What is a perinatal mental health disorder? What is it like to deal with infant loss or whatever else, birth trauma, that kind of on a very superficial level, but what are these things and why might someone need more time for them? Um, and, essentially it's some of the same stuff in terms of what I'd want the manager to do
Mm.
on the from any leave, which is grant as much flexibility as you possibly can and understand that this person is in the midst of a transition and may need some extra leeway, but that they want usually to be back, um,
Mhm.
be doing the best that they can, and that any flexibility you can give them is going to benefit everybody long term.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I've seen too many times when um, somebody goes back, or I'll get them later on down the road. Somebody goes back before they were ready to go back, meaning they're still dealing with a perinatal mental health condition. And to your one of your other points earlier, um, they go back too soon. They become additionally overwhelmed, and the stress returns because it hadn't totally resolved anyways, and then have to go back out on leave. So like for people that I'm supporting in the transition, I always suggest to them to request returning part-time or to ease back in if they can. And um, it's even just that sometimes people don't even realize that's an option. They feel like they
Yep.
have to go back and do like just jump totally back in. But like easing that feels really important from the client side, but from the provider side, it is so, what you're describing is so needed, that the company or organization, that's what I meant to say, the company or organization side, they need that education too, and they need the tools, and often it seems like often that's not really something that they've been taught or shown that they can do.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly why I kind of not shifted, but added to my work, right? Because I do all of this individual work and I still do that. That's still kind of my bread and butter, if you will, and I love it. But when I see, to connect to where we started, right? When I see the same problem happening again and again and again, and recognize there's the system level that's infecting everybody and nobody's calling it out, I
Mm-hmm.
like can't just sit on my hands, right? And
Exactly. Yeah.
I've that's where I've started to try to do a lot of advocacy work and get into corporations and say, we need to do better,
Mm-hmm.
right? That
Mm-hmm.
you guys, not maybe you individually, HR individual or CEO, but as a whole, we need to do better for our working parents.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and here are some easy ways to do it, right? And some of the things that I'm asking for aren't always huge, expensive asks, right? Like you said, allowing people to part-time to transition back part-time. I mean, I just had a mom and a baby group who, said there is no flexibility from her corporation. She comes back 4 days a week, full-time, 4 days in the office, 5 days a week, full-time, no easing in. And she's like, I asked and they were totally inflexible. And my heart just broke because I
Yeah.
was like, she was only asking just to work at home more often at first,
Mm-hmm.
right? Even less hours, and they were just completely rigid around it. Um, and yet, I mean, it would have been such an easy thing, such an easy yes from a corporate standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Right. Even if it's just for a week.
Right. It wasn't a forever, it wasn't a permanent fast, right? It's the idea of could you work at home for like the first 2 weeks?
Yeah.
Just to get your feet back into like your brain back into thinking that way while the nanny gets situated and all
Yep.
of, we developed a different plan for her, but it shouldn't have to be like that, right? We shouldn't have to individually keep solving this problem as mothers.
For sure. Yeah. So you talk about something else, the five leadership lessons of parenting. And can you talk about what that is? And
Yeah, this is like one of my favorite things to talk about because it connects back to that growth of transitions, right? I think so often we think of parenting and work as these two silos that are separate and interfere with one another.
mhm, mhm.
We can't, and that's a really relatable feeling, right? So many moms feel like I can't be the employee I want to be. I'm failing at work and I'm failing at home because I can't show up in either of these domains. And
Totally.
I like to help people recognize the way in which they actually inform one another. And we grow in both areas simultaneously. And specifically, how parenting actually makes us better at our jobs. Because I think there is a
Mhm.
story out there that the opposite is true, right? That parenting
Right.
interferes with how we show up at work. And while that may be sometimes true in terms of hours in, hours out, I think there are bigger picture things at play that are really important to notice. So I call them my 5 Ps. And they're always kind of work in progress, but the first is people skills, right? And so as a new parent, you know that you make all of these strides in reading and regulating emotions and communicating them, right? Our brains change to allow that to happen. But those are the exact same things as like the soft skills that we talk about that are important to leadership,
Mm.
right? Empathic leadership is getting a lot more airtime these days. You have to be able to read others' emotions and be an emotionally intelligent person in order to be a good leader. Parenting
Absolutely.
helps us with that.
Mhm.
Um, the second one is processing skills, things like decisiveness, prioritization, being adaptable, right? I I say that as a parent, you are basically constantly drinking from the fire hose, right? Like you are taking in so much information, whether it's your first or your fourth. There's just a lot of new that comes with it, and you're making lots of quick decisions and kind of getting that information into your brain in an integrated way really quickly. That's an incredible skill to develop, right? For a workplace. Think about what leadership entails, or if you even think every individual, what does my job entail? The faster you can take in information and process it, the better. And so you're already getting better at that skill. The next one is productivity. This is kind of one of those no brainers in some way, right? Like there's that old adage if you want something done, give it to a working mother because they will figure it out and they will figure it out quickly. And so there's this sense of um, I learn how to use every second of time I have as a parent because I don't want to waste it. If I have time, I want to spend it with my kids, not doing extra work. And so I get even more productive at work and cut out fluff, if you will. So that's again really appealing from an employer point of view.
Right.
Uh, the next one is planning skills or perspective taking. So that's thinking about anticipating needs, the ability to multitask. You can hold both the big picture vision and what the small steps are to get there. Um, for this one, I like to use the analogy, especially as we're hitting summertime, going to the beach with your kids, right? The big picture is we're going to go have a lovely day at the beach and it's going to be fun and it's going to go well. All right. But now, as a parent, I'm thinking, what time's nap time? We have to be there before a kid falls asleep. Do we have the sunscreen? Do we have the toys? Do we have the floaties? Do we have the right swimsuits? Do we have snacks that my children will eat and that won't get sandy and the right water bottles and enough to keep everything cold? And I have to carry all of this stuff across the sand without dropping it all like some sort of crazy Sherpa,
Right.
right? So we can all envision what that looks like as a parent. We all know that feeling. That is to some extent what project management is at work, right? I know
Mhm.
where we're going, and here's all the nitty gritty details to get there, and I'm going to do both at once. And then the last one, which I personally is my favorite, but I think gets not enough attention, is playfulness, right? So back in my like research career before I became a clinician, one of the variables I looked at a lot was playfulness because it creates the creation of positive emotions allows for better problem solving. and more creative thinking and being kind of more outside the box. And you need a lot of that, both as a parent, right? If it's like, all right, how am I going to convince my toddler that they need to wear shoes when it's 30 degrees outside?
Right.
But you also benefit from that at work, right? If we can think creatively and kind of get outside of a problem, we're just going to be able to solve it that much better.
Hmm.
And kids often do bring out our playful sides, right? Even if I don't necessarily mean in like traditional, even board games or pretend play, but just again, being silly, capturing a little bit of a moment, right? Seeing a puddle as something to splash in rather than something to avoid. That playful thinking is really beneficial in both worlds. So
Hmm.
I know I went on for a while, but it's, I think, so helpful to reframe this challenge as something positive.
Hmm.
It's additive to our lives rather than detracting from our work.
Absolutely. I mean, that, so you're talking about both from the parent perspective and employer perspective.
Yeah,
For the employer to also see all the new and or improved assets that the employee has.
yeah, right. And to think about, oh, that's maybe why it's important to retain our working parents and keep them here because they do bring a lot to the table. Um,
Right.
yeah.
I mean, those are so important. Also, yeah, from the parent perspective, to be able to go in feeling that they have a set of strengths as opposed to going back into work feeling like they, are one down or they've lost some skill set or they're behind or something like that. Going in with a new confidence or something at least to lean on, I assume it can help a lot in just feeling their agency in returning to work.
Yes, 100%. And it's one of those things where, like, I know from my own experience that I'm 100% better clinician for having been a parent.
Hmm.
Uh, but I feel like our field is maybe a little easier to see how it contributes, right?
Yeah.
In terms of these different life experiences and just understanding people as you watch them develop. Um, I think in other fields, it's not so intuitive and obvious. And that's
Hmm.
where it needs to be spelled out for
Absolutely.
individuals, like you said, for their own confidence level, in addition to recognizing it from a big picture employer level.
Right.
And the maybe the last thing I'll touch on for today, and along those lines, right, where if we're thinking about again work, parenting, I get a lot of questions about balance, and we've moved. I think some people have moved from balance to integration, and this idea that they kind of work together. Um, but I don't mind balance with a caveat. I think
Hmm.
that the caveat is to recognize that balance is not um, a permanent state of being, right? If you think about the experience of standing on one foot, right? If you're listening to this and you're somewhere where you can, just do it right now, right? You are not typically, at least if I'm standing on one foot, I'm not rock solid. I am making all sorts of teeny tiny micro movements and maybe even some big movements, right? I might kind of tip to one side and then tip to the other a bit. There's this ongoing dance essentially that's happening when I'm talking about balancing.
Hmm.
And working parenthood is too, right? We're going to have seasons that we lean into one thing or the other, and it doesn't have to look consistent for it to quote be right. In fact, there is no right or wrong here.
Hmm.
And so I like to give parents permission to say it's okay to have it look, quote, unbalanced for a while. That's actually part of the bigger zoomed out picture, right?
Right.
So
Right.
if I have got a project that my boss hands to me and I'm excited about it and I want to work on it and that's taking extra time and that means I'm having a little less time with my kids right now, or we're eating takeout a lot, or we're living out of laundry baskets
Hmm.
because I have the clothes put away, that's fine, right?
Yes.
And then there may be a time where my kid is sick, or I just want more time with them, or something else is shifting it. And I'm not working after 5 o'clock for a while. And I'm saying, putting that down, that's what it's going to look like, right? And it may be out of out of balance for a week and then shift. It may be that you're out of kind of on a leaned over to one side, I guess, for 6 months or a year, but that it's going to ebb and flow. And when we let it be this process rather than a final product, we're usually a lot happier, right? Because there's a lot less judgment of how it should or shouldn't be. It just is how it is in that moment.
Absolutely. That is fantastic. And thanks for bringing that in. It's so important. And if through this whole the whole journey from, all of the perinatal period and returning to work and all of that, it's that standing on the 1 foot analogy just is usable everywhere. So
Yeah.
thank you for bringing that in, and thank you for sharing all of this with us today. It's been a great conversation.
Well, again, thank you so much for having me. I love talking about this stuff.
To learn more about how you can navigate your parental leave, go to drannwelsh.com. You can also find her on Instagram at Dr. Welsh Coaching and on LinkedIn at Dr. Ann Welsh. And please share this episode to people who you know are approaching the parental leave question and really trying to figure out how they can get the most out of their leave. Or if you're an organization and you'd like to be able to support your employees better, also share this episode, learn more, reach out to Dr. Ann Welsh. Thank you so much for being with me. Until next time.